Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome to our executive briefing, a cybersecurity guide for accounting and financial services. I'm Lee Hodgson, Senior Technology Strategist with Rodin, and very excited to be sharing the stage with Ashley Brown, our Head of Technical Services at Rodin today. Look, we're here to share with you some relevant insights and I guess to help you be more informed about what's actually going on in the cybersecurity space that is relevant to your industries in accounting financial services practice. We're also going to share with you some actionable steps that you can immediately apply today to be, I guess, more effective in managing risk in your organization. We also have a few minutes at the end for any questions. So if there's anything that sort of comes up, you can pop them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to get them towards the end. So look, with that, let's jump right in. So for us, as an IT provider, we're on the front line and we're seeing cybersecurity that cybercrime, I should say, affecting people from all walks of life, but it's definitely hitting small businesses overall the hardest. So, while cyber attacks on large companies and government agencies, they kind of seem to get the majority of the news coverage. It's smaller businesses in general that one, they're more vulnerable to cyber criminals, and they're definitely suffering more proportionately from the results of those cyber attacks. So while it is true that smaller businesses might not be directly targeted in the same way, say, an Optus or Medibank might be, attackers tend to be casting a broader net. So it's more opportunistic, and it's that lack of experienced cybersecurity operations staff, underinvestment in cybersecurity, and I guess smaller IT budgets overall that are contributing factors to this level of vulnerability. But also, in our sector, your businesses are prime targets for cyber attacks because a lot of you hold and process sensitive information. So things like your client's personal data, bank account information, financial records, tax file numbers, payroll data, copies of identity documents, and investments data. So these are all the things that are quite lucrative targets for these bad actors. And I do just want to take a moment to reflect on the reality of the current threat landscape. So this year has been a particularly challenging year for your industry. So we've seen a number of practices become victims. And one of the reasons that we're seeing this uptick in attacks is because of things like the rise of ransomware groups. So these are organized cybercrime groups that carry out targeted attacks and operate, they often operate ransomware as a service tools that affiliates can purchase to carry out their own attacks. And one such group that we come across was one known as Hunters International. So they've successfully orchestrated a number of attacks in the sector this year. A couple of examples we've seen include a small Brisbane-based practice that succumbed to a ransomware attack, and this all came to light when the group listed the firm on its dark web leak site. So they're publishing that they have data on the organisation. Another one in April was by the same group, which saw another small firm held to ransom. So the attackers, the same group, stole about 60 odd gig worth of data, which was categorized into client files and financial data. And that data was also posted on their website. So these breaches, they often start out and seemingly small, like an email account compromise. And I'd say a lot of you would have probably experienced something similar in your organizations at some point. And while they can seem sort of relatively benign, they can quickly escalate into much bigger problems, and then all of a sudden you're in a notifiable data breach scenario or something worse. So it is really important to ensure that you have capabilities in place to be able to detect and contain threats before they escalate. And I will talk a little bit more in a bit about, I guess, those best practices and things you should be doing. But before I do, I want to hand over to Ashley now. He's going to give a bit deeper insight into, I guess, and break down some of the common threats that we see, the most common ones, and also show you kind of how these bad actors are getting past your multi-factor authentication, and also delve into some of the, I guess, known and maybe unknown costs of a cyber incident. So, Ash.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Yeah, as Lee said, I'm going to take you guys through some things we're seeing most recently with cyber incidents, specifically for industries like yourselves. Ransomware does remain the biggest threat for small businesses. Ransomware attacks can be highly lucrative for cyber criminals. So with many small businesses actually being forced to pay large sums of money to regain access to their data, and makes them prime targets. Small businesses often lack the extensive cybersecurity resources and, I guess, expertise found in larger organizations, which does make them more vulnerable and less capable, to defend themselves and respond accordingly. A ransomware attack can cause significant operational disruptions for small businesses as well, which obviously can lead to downtime, loss of productivity, and potential revenue losses as well. And that can be devastating for small businesses. And ransomware attacks are becoming more sophisticated. So cyber criminals are using more advanced tactics, such as phishing and social engineering, exploiting vulnerabilities in software. And it's making it really hard for businesses to defend themselves. And small businesses often handle sensitive data, like yourselves, and that may be subject to data protection regulations. And a ransomware attack can compromise this data, which can open you guys up to legal and compliance issues, as well as damage to your reputation. The first thing I wanted to go through was a business email compromise. So we're seeing a lot of this at the moment. It's been ticking up in recent times. There's a few different flavors of business email compromise, or BECs as they're more commonly known. In 2024, business email compromises made up 15% of all social engineering attacks, and we've seen a significant increase in these types of attacks in the past 12 months. Basically, a business email compromise attack is when an email account is taken over by a cyber criminal for the purpose of fraud or some other malicious purpose. You've also got vendor email compromises, which is basically a compromise on the vendor, the other side. That could be your client or another organization that you're working with. Basically, what happens, the attacker, I'll just step you through what's on the screen here. Basically, the attacker will spoof your domain or impersonate an employee, attempting to basically phish whoever they're targeting. Usually, the person receives an email and they click a link, get taken to a fake website or something that has a malicious attachment, and the attacker basically gains access to the person's mailbox, and then they take it from there and send further emails out, trying to obviously attack the business or get information about your customers. Lee touched on a couple of examples in the industry that he's seen before, and we've seen plenty of these in the past 12 months. We'll just jump to the next slide, Lee. A question you might ask yourself, and Lee touched on at the start, is how do attackers get access to our accounts? We've got multi-factor authentication. How do they get access to someone's mailbox? And that's a great question. There's been a significant spike in account takeovers, and basically the main thing that we're seeing right now is what's called a pass the cookie attack, where basically users are tricked into accessing a fake website that's designed to appear legitimate, usually from an email they've received with an attachment or a link that's a phishing email. The user enters their work credentials into that fake site, but the attacker doesn't only steal their credentials, they also steal the session cookie or the session token, which then gives them the ability to use those credentials and that token to basically bypass multi-factor authentication and gain access to the account. So it does highlight that multi-factor authentication is really not enough on these days, but that's just a quick explanation on how these attackers are actually doing this. Next, we'll move on to the cost, Lee. So Lee touched on this at the start, known versus hidden costs. So the image on the screen, it's a good diagram to, I guess, highlight the difference or that you have potentially don't know about some hidden costs. You've obviously got direct financial costs, which are at the top there, including recovering lost assets and ransom payments. You've got reputational damage, which might not be so obvious, including the loss of client trust, loyalty, and new business. And there's some things that definitely probably aren't obvious to most organizations is attrition costs. So things like the impact on staff and retention ongoing, as well as recruitment. And then even extreme impacts that are becoming more common, like national security issues, cyber warfare and even loss of life can be quite serious depending on the size and the type of the attack. Cool. I'll jump to the next slide. Yeah, just to touch a bit more on reputational damage. So 41% of CISOs and C-level executives that were surveyed were named reputational damage as being one of the biggest costs to their business following a cyber attack. And 34% agreed loss of clientele was a significant cost as well. Obviously, losing future business from existing customers is a real possibility if you lose their confidential data or their assets are put at risk by a breach that you suffer. And some clients might feel forced to terminate contracts, end things early if things are considered to be severe enough, which ultimately has an immediate impact on revenue. And then last thing was attrition rates. Just want to touch on that a bit further. So over half of office workers surveyed in a recent survey said that if their business experienced a recent cyber breach, it would influence the decision for them to stay with that company. And more than 1 in 2 C-level executives, so over 50%, say that they've been breached in the last 12 months alone. Most office workers are unaware. Only 39% of their organisation have been breached. So being able to instill complete confidence and trust in your existing and future clients and partners is paramount. It's obviously building strong business relationships, and a threat to your name, your business, your reputation is potentially disastrous. And with that, I'll hand back over to you, Lee.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ash. Look, yeah, the impact on reputation, I don't think that can be overstated. Your clients today, they have clear expectations about the way you manage their information and their data, and that standing that you've worked so hard to build up over many years can really take a fraction of that time to fall apart. There's also, as directors, you have responsibilities for cyber under a number of different forms of legislation. So we have the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, the Privacy Act, and for some of you, the regulated by ASIC as well. So in terms of legislation, some of this is currently under review by the government, and I'm going to go into some of the proposed changes shortly. However, with regards to the Privacy Act, so there's obligations there to protect personal information and report breaches. So there are also class action provisions that provide a mechanism for victims to seek compensation. As part of the Privacy Act, there is also the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme. So essentially what that means is that organizations need to promptly notify any affected individuals and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner about any breaches that are likely to result in serious harm. So some pretty serious penalties there for failing to comply. So 2.5 million for individuals and up to 50 million for companies, or 30% of turnover. They were increased in 2022 following the Optus and Medibank breaches. And then for those of you that are Australian Financial Services licensees, you're also required to adequately manage cybersecurity risks as part of your licensee obligations. So that includes things like having adequate technological systems, policies, procedures that they should be in place to ensure sensitive consumer information is protected and to minimize the risk of harm. ASIC has and has taken enforcement action when a licensee has not met these obligations in the past. So recently, we saw them take action against a licensee who was found to have breached its license obligations by failing to do the necessary things. So it was RI Advice Group. So they had a number of found to have a number of inadequate risk management practices across its network. That also extended down to the representatives as well. So failures of having to have up-to-date software, backups, antivirus, email, just basic sort of fundamental things as well. So there's definitely some things to be considering there. And I mentioned there's also some change on the way. So the Australian government has something in place called the Australia Cybersecurity Strategy starting in 2020. And as part of that, the government's considering stronger cybersecurity regulation and also incentives to support, I guess their goal is to support our growing digital economy, but also respond to growing threats. And I guess the overarching principles there that they're looking to address are setting clear cybersecurity expectations. So things like standards and security minimums for businesses, Increasing transparency, so businesses and their customers should have clear information about the security of products and services. There's also talk or some things in the pipeline around a certification following some sort of assessment of compliance that they're working on, as well as protecting consumer rights and having appropriate legal remedies for victims as well. There's also some changes in the works for the Privacy Act. So the Attorney General's review was recently completed of the Privacy Act, and they've put forward their report. So they've put forward about 116 proposals that, if they're all implemented, will be some of the most dramatic change we've seen to Australian privacy and data protection. And out of those, there are 38 that have been agreed to by the government, and they include things like increasing privacy protections for children and vulnerable individuals, strengthening security and data destruction obligations, and greater powers for enforcement as well. There's a further 68 that have been agreed to in principle. So they include things of removal of the small business exemption and employee records exemption from the Privacy Act, a 72-hour notification requirement in relation to the notifiable data breaches scheme. And so these reforms here that have been agreed to in principle, they still require a little bit further consideration. But there are currently 3 bills that have been introduced to the Parliament in October. I think probably the one that's been most relevant to you all today is they're looking at or put forward a proposal for mandatory reporting for ransomware as well. I suppose the good news is that there is some really good guidance and best practice frameworks to assist you to develop an effective security strategy. And a lot of the things that these guidelines and frameworks are talking about are, for the most part, simple foundational things that you can do to significantly reduce risk. It's more just that the things that we were doing 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, they don't quite hold up today in today's environment. So the Australian Signals Directorate Essential 8 is a set of cybersecurity strategies that were developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre to mitigate cyber threats. I won't go into all of the details of each today, but as you can see, they include pretty common sense things like daily backups and disaster recovery testing, multi-factor authentication, patching operating systems and applications. But they also have certain specifications about the way they are implemented to avoid less secure deployments, and also controls that bring checks and logging to aid investigation into if there was an incident, something like that. And so the Australian government, through the Australian Signals Directorate, is recommending that all Australian organisations adopt the Essential 8 as, I guess, the foundational things that they should be doing. So ASIC has also some really good guidance for you as well through their resilience good practice for regulated businesses. So they have some guidelines around cyber resilience and good practices. So they talk about things like board engagement, good governance, and they've also got some documentation, advice, and checklists that you can follow, similar to other bodies that you might be really working with as well, like CPA Australia. They all have some similar advice for you as well. All of this guidance that's coming through is all pretty much telling you to do the same thing in one way or another. So they're all talking about the foundational things that are good at preventing breaches from happening, like the Essential 8, but we also need to plan for what happens during and after a breach. So what we do during and after a breach, it's often one of those things that's overlooked, but it's, a lot of the focus we find is often put on stopping it from happening, but no one can guarantee you 100% that you're not going to have a breach. So it's a crucial part. And what I find is that what you can see on the screen there is something called the NIST framework, and it's a widely adopted and internationally, it does a really great job of laying out all the components on a single page required for effective cyber risk management. So you have the things there that are left of boom. So they're things that we'll do prior to an attack. But if the boom happens, it's also vital that you have a plan for what to do right of boom or post-breach, or when a breach is happening. That's where your incident response comes in. So we have processes to identify our information assets and what we do to protect them. But then on the right, we also have detect. So how do we know that there has been a breach? And I guess the question there is, would you rather find out when your security monitoring and detection team tells you, or when your client information, like those examples before, has been leaked on the dark web, or your clients are receiving spam emails. So it's important that you've got capabilities in place to be able to continually monitor and detect for security events. And I will say that's usually not something that your IT support company can do themselves. Then you've also got responding and recovering. So these are the things that we do to respond when a breach has happened, and then how do we recover to business as usual? And one of the key components of that is an up-to-date cyber incident response plan. And that's a documentation that will answer the questions that you're going to have in a breach. It's things like, well, what do we do? Who do we need? Who do we notify? How do we notify them? And I always say that, when you're going through a breach, it's not the time to be figuring this stuff out. But also speaking about response and recovery, we also get asked a lot about where insurance fits. So cyber insurance, it could be an important tool in managing risks, and those policies will usually help with the cost of business interruption or recovery. So they'll include things like losses experienced. They could be recovery costs, damage to data, investigations, remediation costs. You might have costs of engaging public relations advisors, lawyers, or other professional service providers, or maybe even losses incurred by third parties. So while an insurance policy will help your business manage the consequences of a breach, or some of them, it should be considered alongside other risk management practices, like the development of a greater risk management strategy. So those controls that we spoke about, risk assessments, and it should be seen as a last resort. You definitely don't want to be testing the limits of your insurance policy. They typically won't help with things like we spoke about before, lost business, reputational damage, whether that's to the business or perhaps your own professional reputation, loss of market share, those sorts of things that Ash touched on earlier. And the insurance market itself is also going through a bit of change that is likely impacting you as well. So, as we see the number of attacks surge, so are the costs of premiums, exclusions, and the standards that have been set by insurers. So some of you may have noticed significant increases over the last few years in your premiums, or more stringent renewal conditions. The things that they're asking for in terms of the controls and things they want you to have in place are all aligned with what we spoke about before from the Essential 8 and NIST guidelines. They're all pretty much talking about the same thing. And exclusions too, I touched on. So it's really important that you understand what is covered by your policy. Increasingly, insurers are limiting things or excluding certain losses from cover, like ransomware, or in some wordings will now limit cover for known vulnerabilities. So that could be something that applies to a vulnerability in a piece of hardware or software, maybe that's end of life, has no more support, or maybe there was a patch available and a fix for that vulnerability. So that's why you really want to make sure that IT is absolutely doing the basics like patching your systems, doing vulnerability management to identify vulnerabilities before they come a breach. Another thing to be aware of as well is that carriers won't pay out if you're misrepresenting on your renewal application forms. So it really is crucial that you involve the right people when filling out those applications. Make sure there are no mistakes. That could be something that has changed on your network, or maybe not understanding what security controls are actually in place or what they're asking for. Or things that have been overlooked. So if you're filling out on behalf of maybe HR or IT, as insurers will or could limit or deny coverage for you in those scenarios as well. So we've covered off on threat landscape, what's at stake, the things you need to know about and strategies you should employ. I would say though, the biggest threat to you all today is really complacency and inaction. The best thing you can do today is to be more informed about where your business stands in relation to current standards we discussed today, and don't just assume that IT has it covered for you. So at Rodin, what we do every day is we take organizations just like yours through that journey towards cyber resilience, and often the best place to start that journey is with a risk assessment. So that would help you to build understanding of organizations' risk in a way that's objective and without bias. Can also give you insurance where there are no gaps or mistakes that could have been overlooked. It also helps support decision making about what risks to prioritize. So for anyone who's joined us today, we will be sending you out a resource that you can use to do your own self-assessment. It's going to give you some preliminary insight into your organization's maturity, and we're also can follow it up with a limited number of base level risk assessments that we'd be happy to offer you today as well, which will be performed by one of our experienced assessors at no cost. So we'll be in touch with some more information about how to engage Rodin for that, if you're wanting to. Lastly, with the stakes being so high and cybersecurity becoming increasingly complex to manage, we can also complement your existing IT provider or team with a managed cybersecurity service as well. So that would enables your team to focus on core IT support responsibilities while we handle the complexity of cybersecurity, where we do alignment with best practice standards like Essential 8 and NIST that we spoke about before as a managed service. We're also pretty excited to have recently launched our secured managed IT services. So one of the things we're firm believers here at Rodin is that modern accounting financial services practices, they simply need more than just day-to-day IT support and upkeep. So we've redefined managed IT service with a security-first approach that integrates cybersecurity and also strategic enablement into the fabric of our service. So obviously reach out to us today if you want to hear a little bit more about that. Otherwise, that pretty much covers off everything I had for today. So we've got a minute or two left if there are any questions. So we do have one that's come through here, and the question is, so how can we effectively prioritize our cybersecurity efforts given our limited resources? And you're right, it is a challenge. We'd all like to do everything possible, but budgets don't always allow for that. I think that's that first part of that journey is being informed about your current standing, and then you can prioritize the risks in line with the potential impacts and likelihood of them occurring, and really go on that journey to maturing and improving things over time. So I hope that covers that off for you. We don't have any more questions that have come through, but please feel free to reach out. You may want to talk to us offline. More than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you had some good takeaways, and we'll let you get on with the rest of your day.